it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. William Hersh. I've known Bill for a while. Bill is currently the department chair for medical informatics and clinical epidemiology at Oregon Health Sciences University. And he hails from Chicago. Also, he actually did his bachelor's in biology from University of Illinois at Champaign, and I won't say when. He got his MD at University of Illinois in Chicago, which I'm very familiar with. And after finishing a residency in general internal medicine, he did his fellowship in medical informatics at Harvard. We know them well. And he's been at OHSU since 1990. And he's one of the few people I know who's been, at one place for a long time. But I know from reading his blog that he has grown in place, and he has an incredible reputation in education and research in biomedical informatics. And I'm pleased to have him here today to talk about his research.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, and it's good to see some other old friends, old that we've known each other for a long time, not that we're old. Anyways, it's a real joy for me to come visit Corvallis. Some of you know why. You'll actually see a picture in a second. It's also good to know what's going on in Oregon, what's going on in your institution. If any of you are undergraduates and are looking for careers in fields like informatics, I'd be happy to talk to you. But what I'm going to share with you over this hour is the research that I currently do. I know this is a research conference, and some of the interesting things that are made possible today by widespread adoption of electronic health records, all this other data that's available, and trying to figure out how to make best use of it. So I will talk about that. I'll talk a little bit about what we sometimes call reuse of clinical data. And the primary purpose for collecting the electronic health record is to document the health care that you got, to bill for it, which has its good and bad sides. And but that data opens the window to other things, and I'll mention that. I'll then talk about the field that I work in, which is actually really a branch of computer science called information retrieval or search. I'm sure every one of you has used search, so it's not like it was years ago where you had to explain to people what it was. And then I'll talk about this work where we focus on trying to identify patient cohorts for things like participation in research studies as an example of the kinds of things you can do with the data that's in electronic health records, even though it's not principally collected for that task. But I mentioned that I do have some connections to this esteemed institution. This picture is probably about 10 years old. We were at a Beavers basketball game. You may notice that I'm an OSU dad. In fact, my car still has the OSU dad sticker. My younger daughter is now a medical student at OHSU, and my older daughter works for Adidas. But they were undergraduates here, so I'm quite familiar with this campus and always enjoy the opportunity. In fact, I've texted them a few pictures today, show them where I was. Okay, back to the research. So again, this notion of what can we do with clinical data. When I'm trained in medicine. When I was in medical school, we wrote everything down on paper, and in some ways, it's easier for physicians to just scribble things down on paper, but people can't often read that, and it's harder to access, and it's certainly difficult to reuse. And so one area of focus of research in biomedical informatics is reuse of clinical data. For what purposes? Things like clinical and translational research. So being able to generate hypotheses like, oh, we find that this group of patients tend to have these attributes. Of course, if we just look at that retrospectively, are there confounders in there? So we might need to do a clinical trial or something like that. Public health surveillance. I know we're in a College of Public Health for emerging threats, whether it's bioterrorism or disease outbreaks, things like that. And then also a big issue in healthcare, which is measuring the quality of care that we deliver. So all of these, in addition to handwriting, to the writing being more legible and accessible, when you walk outside the hospital, if you're an on-call physician, you can dial in and see some information about the patient. But all of that has been facilitated by the adoption of electronic health records. And over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of federal money that's gone into it. And so we really have, we used to say 10 years ago, healthcare is the last industry to become digital. Well, it's mostly digital now. There's still plenty of paper. But 96% of hospitals and 86% of physicians are the latest statistics. So I mentioned that I work in this field called information retrieval. We often say it's a sub-area of computer science, but there's people in library and information science, biomedical informatics, are interested in this notion of search. Again, some of you in this room are as old enough as I am, and there was a time when you couldn't just go type something into a search engine to find what you're looking for. In fact, I often wonder why I didn't think about ranking the web pages by how many other pages point to them that made the founders of Google so wealthy, and I'm still an academic. Anyways, I've been working in this area for a long time. I've written a book. It's actually a little bit out of date. I'm supposed to be writing a next edition. Information retrieval used to be focused on finding documents, so things like scientific abstracts, scientific articles, other kinds of document repositories. But now we have many different types of data, images, sounds, videos, etc., structured data that we want to retrieve. And one of those is medical records, and that's what I'm focused on. But before I get into that, let me just give you a little bit of background. My research really over the span of my career has focused on evaluating how well these systems work. And there's two broad ways that we can look at how an information retrieval system works. We can look at the system itself, the software, the algorithms, or we can look at how people interact with it, how people actually use it. And I've done both kinds of studies. It's a little bit easier to focus on the system because then you don't have to go recruit people to come use it, and you can develop what are called test collections I'll describe in a moment that give you a way to measure, and basically what we're looking for is how much relevant information. So when you all go do a Google or a PubMed search, you see that some of what you retrieve is highly relevant to what you're looking for, another isn't. And ideally, the best retrieval system will give you mostly relevant information, although some would argue that it's good to have a little serendipity in there because you occasionally learn other things when your search isn't so perfect for you. And we use these measures called recall and precision. Oftentimes, we want to combine them into a single statistic. There's going to be a few things I talk about today where I just don't have time to go into some of the technical details, but there's a number of different ways you can combine recall and precision, which I'll actually define on the next slide, to get a single number to help you compare whether one approach works better than another. But if we don't want to focus exclusively on this because we find when people actually use search systems, they use them in many different ways, and the neat algorithms that you come up with can be completely undone by people who either don't know or are trying to outsmart the system or so forth. So there's a big part of looking at users, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So in terms of evaluating retrieval systems, how do we do that? So we call them in information retrieval test collections. They're really a standardized data set consisting of content, so some collection of information. Again, historically it was documents, but these days people do retrieval of images and sounds and things like that. You then have what we call topics or information need statements. What was some user realistically looking for? And then you actually have relevance judgments. You annotate the data. You have experts say, yes, this document is relevant to this topic, and that gives you, I'll use the term gold standard, but it really is more probably like a silver or bronze standard, because it turns out there's disagreements on what people think is relevant or not. But it gives you a measure, a way to measure how well your system's working and how you can compare different algorithms. You then basically take your collection of topics, you feed it into the system in something called a run, and then you get your retrieval output. It's measured against these metrics of recall and precision, and you can compare how your system does, how someone else's system does, and this helps us build the best possible systems that ultimately will put in the hands of users. So these are the metrics of recall and precision, and you, even though you may not have heard of these, you might think of them when you search. So recall is of all the relevant information out there that you could retrieve, what do you actually retrieve? Some of you may use a term called sensitivity, when oftentimes we use that in like diagnostic testing for medicine. Recall is basically the same thing. How many people do we identify, or in this case, how many relevant documents do we identify by our search? Oftentimes these collections are huge, millions, I guess in the case of Google, billions of documents. You can't possibly judge each one. So we use relative recall, where we just, we don't do measures of relevance on the entire collection because we can't. And then precision is of what we get back. How much of it is relevant. And there tends to be a trade-off between the two. If you really want to cast your net broadly, thank you. If you want to really cast your net broadly to get a high recall, you may pay a price in precision, and your precision might be low. So you might have to look through a lot of documents to actually find those relevant ones. And again, there's ways of combining these into a single measure. Now, another thing that we do in information retrieval, which people do in many other fields, are what we call challenge evaluations. There's a number, some of you might be involved with some of the data science challenge evaluations, Kaggle, things like that. In information retrieval, there's actually this one conference that does these annual challenge evaluations, where different research groups work on the same test collection, so the same documents or information, the same information items, the same topics, and so they can compare. They sometimes degenerate a little bit into bake-offs, but in the best case, people learn from what works for some research groups and not others. And so again, we develop these test collections. Typically, all the participating groups do their runs, they submit their results, and then all of the documents get pooled, and so we can then do these relevance judgments, so we can measure things like recall and precision. So, you know, how well, a lot of my early work focused on things like Medline abstracts. But again, in recent years, which I'll be talking about more in this talk, is actually applying this sort of approach to medical records. And I'll explain that in a moment. So I mentioned these annual, these challenge evaluations. The granddaddy in the information retrieval field is one called TREC, Text Retrieval Conference. I've been to almost every one of these. They're actually mostly non-biomedical, things like web searching or corporate repository searching, but through myself and a few others leading these efforts in some of the biomedical things. We actually started with one where we were looking at genomics documents, and then have moved in other ways, and including the medical records I'll talk about in a moment. TREC has actually spawned other ones. One of the areas of TREC of interest early on was cross-language information retrieval. So this is a much bigger problem in places like Europe, where everyone speaks multiple languages, and there's a mandate by the European Union that certain types of information be available in every language. So how do we maybe query in one language and retrieve documents in another? An interesting sidebar that came out of it's called CLAY, that's the French pronunciation of the acronym, is an image retrieval challenge evaluation that I was also involved with, which was a lot of fun doing medical image retrieval. There's a lot of things going on these days with medical images, some of the machine learning you might be familiar with, but again, it was the same sort of thing. Find me chest x-rays that have evidence of pneumonia or tuberculosis, things like that. And then TREC has also kind of set the stage for other kinds. If any of you work in natural language processing and in biomedical natural language processing, you may have heard of the what used to be called I2B2 shared task. Now they changed the name to N2C2. But these are similar kinds of things. There are people who do natural language processing and do these standardized tasks to compare their systems versus other ones. So around 2011, we came into having access to this test collection that had actually been developed. If any of you work in medical NLP, you may know someone named Wendy Chapman, who developed this de-identified collection of electronic health records. And we had to kind of come up with a task our task was basically trying to retrieve patients who fit certain search criteria. And our focus was going to be this identifying patients who might be candidates for recruitment into clinical studies, which for any of you who work in medical settings know that's always a challenge. You can be at a big academic medical center. You may have lots of patients who are potential candidates to recruit to take part in studies that are going on, clinical trials, whatever, and it can be challenging to find them and then see if they're interested in participating. Usually these tracks and TREC run for several years longer. We actually, and I'll talk about this because it's one of the challenges of this kind of work, it only ran for 2 years, but there were, you'll see about 30 research groups that participated, and it really enabled us to get a view on what kinds of techniques for this particular task worked and did not work. So this is the data set we had. Most of you are probably somewhat familiar with medical records if you ever go to a doctor, but it's different from, say, when you go to search PubMed and there's however many now, 25 million abstracts. Medical records are linked first of all to encounters with the healthcare system, and then those encounters are all linked to a single patient. And oftentimes in this, like in the task of identifying patients for clinical studies, we want to identify the patient, not their discharge summary. So how do we identify the patient? So the collection from the University of Pittsburgh had about 17,000 visits or encounters with the healthcare system, a total of a little over 100,000 reports. And this is just an example, and any of you who's ever seen a medical record know that this kind of looks pretty familiar to what a discharge summary might look like. And so again, the goal is to identify the patients, or in this case, the visit. Now, because these records were de-identified, they broke the link. Some of these visits belong to the same person, but we didn't know that, and we had no way of discovering that because of the de-identification process. And it turns out that one of the most challenging parts of this particular kind of research has been what to do about de-identification of individuals, because I don't think any of you would want your medical records with your full identification to be part of this collection that all these researchers download and play around with. It really gets to the heart at a growing challenge in a lot of types of computational research is the identification of individuals. I'll come back to that a little bit. So in the process of de-identification, so they had to remove all the protected health information, PHI, what probably most of you know about the 19 elements that identify people, things like name, date of birth, address, other kinds of things, medical record number. And then we had to break these links, which I mentioned on the last slide. And then we also, another problem that we have with this sort of researcher is as time goes on, medical institutions are getting a little bit more nervous with all the high profile privacy breaches and things like that. It can be a challenge to get them to release data, even if it's been de-identified. And I think that's an issue kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but is something that we all as researchers with clinical data somehow need to figure out. So this slide shows the number of documents per visit. So what all it's meant to show is that for a lot of patients, there may have only been one document. In fact, if the patient didn't get admitted to the hospital, if they were just in the emergency department. But for some patients, there were large numbers. In fact, 23 of the patients had more than 100 reports. And so, you know, if you're trying to develop a retrieval system where you have over 100 reports that are mapped to the thing that you're trying to retrieve versus some of them have one, it just makes the task a little more challenging. So we started with this retrieval task in 2011, again, identifying patients as candidates for clinical studies. That was right around the time that a lot of work was going on actually around healthcare reform and identifying medical critical research priorities. So we tried to focus on those as our information needs because we thought it would be kind of relevant in a larger sense. And then we actually had to have people who made these judgments so we could build our gold standard. And they were, we actually have a fair number of physicians in our graduate program who we paid to do the relevance assessments. So basically each of these research groups could submit these runs. So again, a run is every topic has a query that goes into the system, and they had to classify them as to whether or not they were automatic, meaning that there was no human, that any processing of the topic was done only by a computer, or manual meant they had a person who helped devise the query. Our resources were somewhat limited, which also limited the measures that we could use, these combined measures. But we did have 29 groups who submitted 127 different runs. So on the vertical axis is either this measure BPREF, which again, it would take me longer than I have to really explain, but just think of it as a combination of recall and precision, where 0 is not retrieving anything relevant and 1 is retrieving everything that's relevant. So one thing you see right off the bat is even the systems that are really good still are far from perfect. And there's two measures, actually. The purple is the BPREF and the blue is the precision at 10, so 10 patients down, how many are relevant. And so you can see there's a few, you know, the actually group from the National Library of Medicine, a group of researchers that did the best, and a lot of other groups that are pretty close. And I forget where the cutoff line for statistical significance is, but it's fairly far down. So there's a lot of the variation here may well just be due to chance, but you do see that group from the National Library of Medicine who did pretty well. But another interesting finding, and this comes out of a lot of these retrieval studies, so I mentioned that there were 35 topics here, so 35 different information needs that people were searching on, and there's a lot of variation within the topics. So some topics are really easy. Almost everyone gets up to 1. Others are extremely hard, and you see the average is way down at the bottom. But interestingly enough, on almost all these topics, there's one group that whatever they happen to do actually did pretty well. And so, so sometimes in information retrieval, and this probably happens in other kinds of research too, we talk about how sometimes averages can obscure the differences that you actually see across different topics, and there's a lot of interaction. Some algorithms people come up with work well for one type of topic, and others less so. So actually, to kind of give you an idea of the kinds of things that these topics actually searched on, and also to kind of group them. So some of these topics were easy, and almost every group did really well. So for whatever reason, the top two, patients with dementia, and the one for cervical spine surgery, were relatively easy in the sense that everyone did well. Some of them were really hard. So patients treated for vascular claudication, for whatever reason, was a difficult one. Acute vision loss. A lot of times these more complex terms where there is dependencies can be difficult. And then there are also ones where you see a large difference. Some people do well, some people don't do as well. But you know, all of these topics listed here are the things that people were searching on. The topics actually had an additional amount of descriptive text that people could also use for their queries that they put into the system. But it gave us the results that I showed on the last two slides. Another thing you can do with data like this is what we call failure analysis. You can actually go in and look, you know, why didn't everyone get 100%? And a student of mine actually went through and looked at visits that were highly retrieved but judged not relevant, or patients that were retrieved by a lot but judged not relevant, and also those who were retrieved by few but had been judged relevant. And some of these are reasons why search systems kind of fail, not really fail, but don't work perfectly. So, you know, a term mentioned as a future possibility. A lot of times in medical record, you know, we might say, you know, keeping an eye out for coronary artery disease because this patient has all these risk factors, or something that was done in the past. Negation, when something, you know, we ruled out appendicitis, or we ruled out dementia. We saw the word dementia on the last slide. And then so these are things why things are not relevant, and then sometimes things are relevant and we miss them. There might be variation in language, synonyms, lexical variants. Sometimes things are not actually named but are inferred by the medical language. There's a lot of, I was talking about this over lunch, there are things kind of between the lines in medical records sometimes that we as humans, especially clinicians, know, but a computer doesn't necessarily. So we can look at, we can do these kinds of analyses that will help us make our systems better in the future. So we did run a second round of this, because this TREC conference is a yearly event. It's actually put on by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which this year's TREC has gotten all messed up because NIST was like shut down for like a month. They turned off all their web servers, and anyways, but the NIST is the one that kind of funds and organizes this. So basically, for the second year, and it's always good to do these tasks for multiple years because people get familiar with the tasks. They saw what worked done the previous year. So we kept the same task, this searching patients for candidates clinical studies, the same collection from the University of Pittsburgh, but then we developed new topics. And in 2012, NIST was actually able to identify more funds to do more of these relevance judgments. And so basically, the way we do these is, again, you can't judge every, in this case, patient who's retrieved by every system, but for each topic that gets submitted, we create pools for judging. So any run any patient that's in the top 15 will get judged, if they're between 16 to 100, they randomly pick 25%. So trying to get a representative sample, and that's why it's good to have a lot of different groups participate in these sorts of things, because they try different algorithms, different approaches, and it gives you kind of a broader collection to judge. And so this time there were 24 groups who participated. You see the same, this is actually the same, very similar graph to the one I showed before about averages. So there you see the averages, and the National Library of Medicine group did well. Again, you see the variation by topic, but you know, some that are very easy, some that are very hard, and then there's always someone, most times, who does pretty well. If you don't know a lot of information retrieval research, there's probably a lot of jargon on this slide. But one of the take-home, I was deciding how much of this slide to put up. But you know, we looked at, like, for example, the National Library of Medicine people. What did they actually do that worked well? Well, one is that they did these manually constructed queries. They also had a search engine, this system called SE, that's a research system developed at the National Library of Medicine that knows some things about medicine. It knows things like synonyms between drug names and things like that. But other people tried things like, sometimes we take clinical questions and put them in the PICO framework, the problem, intervention, comparator, outcome. That didn't work too well. People tried to recognize negation, because on some of those topics, and sometimes in medical records, it's real helpful to recognize when someone's saying the patient doesn't have this disease. Things like term expansion, expanding different synonyms and things like that, those did not work well. In terms of the best automated results, at least in the first year, people could try to filter the topic by the patient's age, their race, gender, and then also synonym expansion. So since a lot of medical terms have multiple synonyms, taking the synonyms and throwing those into the query actually, for a number of these groups, actually helped. Interestingly enough, there are kind of more general ways to do term expansion. There are sometimes we'll use kind of more general types of thesaurus, and that helps in a lot of generic information retrieval tasks, but didn't really help here. Also trying to focus in on a specific part of the document. For some types of searching, like for example, when you're searching for scientific papers, you might in the abstract focus in on the methods or the results section. Those types of approaches didn't really apply well to medical records, so for whatever reason. So we actually wanted to continue the TREC medical records track. There were some issues with the University of Pittsburgh, with the provider of the data, and unfortunately, the NIST and University of Pittsburgh couldn't work out the differences, so the track kind of ended a little prematurely. But about that time, there was a young faculty, originally at Mayo Clinic, although fortuitously his wife actually, who's a physician, matched in her residency in ophthalmology at OHSU. So he changed institutions, and he had kind of forged this collaboration with a group of researchers at Mayo Clinic and myself, and some of you may know Stephen Bedrick at OHSU. And we wanted to really continue this kind of work, but without the de-identified data, which meant that we couldn't share the data. So basically, we wrote the grant proposal saying that OHSU and Mayo Clinic will work in parallel. We'll share our methods and what works, but they can't see our data, we can't see theirs, and unfortunately, the rest of the research community can't see our data either. They had developed some methods using a technique called language modeling that showed some benefits with the TREC medical records track. So we convinced the National Library of Medicine to fund this work, and this has been a significant part of my own research the last few years. So again, we wanted to get medical records because we were keeping everything local. We didn't have to worry about de-identification and breaking links across patient visits and things like that. So at OHSU, some of you may know of our research institute called Oak Tree. They have a research data warehouse which pulls data out of our EPIC electronic health record system, and we got our IRB to actually agree. That was our biggest worry, is whether the IRB would let us do this, but we convinced them that the data would be stored very securely. The only people who could look at it would be those on the research team, and then Mayo did the same thing. So we have built this collection, and we decided to aim for 100,000 patients, which means that if you get medical care at OHSU, there's a 1 in 5 chance that you're in this collection. But you know, again, since medical records have many encounter attributes and many notes and things like that, so there's 10 million notes in this collection. It takes up about I think it's about 60 gigabytes, which in this day and age is big, but it's not huge. And we also have medications, demographics, laboratory results, surgery, vital signs, et cetera. So it's a pretty big, robust collection of information. So then we had to develop these topics, these information needs. Again, we looked to our research institute, the Translational Research Institute. In these test collections, we try to take topics, information need statements that are real, that someone actually had. We found 29 that worked well. Then Mayo Clinic had some Mayo Clinics involved in this project some of you have heard of called eMERGE, where they had developing this phenotype knowledge base, healthcare quality measures. There's also the world-famous Rochester Epidemiology Project that tracks like half the population across Minnesota, and then some other topics that Mayo had. And just to show you, so these are some samples that I just pulled. You know, there's 56 of these in total. I just pulled out 5 here to try to represent the different kinds of things. These, for the most part, are actual information needs that someone searching a repository of patient information had. So inflammatory bowel disease, vitamin D results in a certain time frame, postherpetic neuralgia, children seen in the emergency department with certain types of diagnoses not due to chemotherapy or radiation, and then a fairly common side effect of a commonly used medication, ACE inhibitors, drugs like enalapril, that have cough. It turns out this is actually a hard one because a lot of people have cough and a lot of people are on ACE inhibitors, but how can you realistically make the connection between the two? So this is an example of the kinds of topics. So this project is still underway. We've done the searching across all the topics, and Mayo has as well, and we're now going through and doing these relevance judgments. We've actually developed a web-based system that makes it easy for the people who do those relevance judgments to quickly navigate through the data and say, this patient is relevant, this patient is not, for the information need. And we started to generate some early results, and it turns out that those kind of typical type a few words into a search engine kind of approach that worked reasonably well in some of the TREC medical records ones are a little more complicated here because these records span, so I mean, some of them probably span over like 5 years or something like that. So sometimes you have to take that time frame into account. But anyways, as we're completing this work, we'll see what kinds of approaches work. We'll test different approaches, and then perhaps do some kind of failure analysis. Where are we going with this in the future other than finishing the current project? So we also have moved in a couple different directions. One is that we got to know a pharmaceutical company that has developed a treatment for a rare disease, a rare genetic disease. Some of you may have heard of. For me, it's one of those things I learned about in medical school, but I don't think I ever saw a real case of. But porphyria, or particularly acute intermittent porphyria, which is due to a genetic defect and an alteration in gene expression. So this compound they've developed actually is an RNA silencing molecule. So it actually has potential in shutting off or shutting down, or at least diminishing the gene expression that can be used to treat this rare condition. And this is a type, some of you have probably heard the term precision medicine, the idea of trying to really be more precise in what causes a disease and how do we treat it. Now, another challenge with porphyria is that because it's a rare disease that has pretty common symptoms. Abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, something that almost everyone in the population has experienced and may even have documented somewhere in their medical record. You went to the doctor one time and you had a stomach ache. And it takes on average about 12 years from the time the symptoms appear to actually making the diagnosis. And it also turns out that this is a highly overdiagnosed disease. We've actually been going through our medical records, and a patient mentions to some doctor sometime that, oh, I have porphyria. As soon as it gets put in the chart, it just gets copied, from someone sees it. Okay, well, this patient has porphyria, and on and on and on. So what we're doing as part of this research project is seeing if we can actually identify some signals, and one of our study team members is a hematologist who's an expert in porphyria, to try to see if we can identify people who at least might be candidates for screening for porphyria and potentially could be treated by this drug that really potentially has a lot of potential to improve life for patients with this very rare condition. So that's one direction we're going. Another one is we're informatics researchers, so we want to see the world have access to the kind of data that we have access to, so other people can develop new algorithms, test new ideas in how we might process this data. On the other hand, it's highly private data. Again, I think I said this before, I don't think any of you, if you do, say, get your care at OHSU, would want your data to be in a database that we send out to 50 research groups. So how do we, and this problem is actually not unique to medicine. There's a research community around email spam detection. How many of you would willingly send your email to a research group that they could distribute to the whole world for someone to do research on? Okay, I don't see any hands up. Or things like corporate document repositories where, or government repository documents where there's highly sensitive, or maybe in the case of government classified. So there are groups that have thought about this problem, and one potential solution is to basically let people send their systems to the data, knowing what the data's, how the data is formatted, maybe having some sample data to kind of see how the system is going to process it, but to basically send in essence, a container that has your information retrieval research system to the data. There are some emerging standard formats for medical record research data. Some of you may have heard of Odyssey, which stands for the Observational Data. Can't remember the rest. Anyways, but the idea is that, like, for example, the groups that participated in that TREC medical records track, they can send their system in a container that would then index and process the data. It gets fed the topics, it spits out results, and they get results back. It's not quite the same as having all the data on your own server and being able to process it, but it would at least give different groups the ability to work on this kind of data. So we're developing this approach and trying to figure out how to do this, how to get it funded, and that may be another future direction that we go. So that's, I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. So let me just kind of, I've kind of told you my research and where it's been going, and then maybe just kind of stepping back in the bigger picture of informatics. These are exciting times for the field. There's lots of interesting projects, work. If you read the newspapers, you know that everyone and their brother is applying machine learning to image analysis and things like that. If you're interested in this, there's actually a issue of the January 2019 issue of Nature Medicine that has not only a bunch of research studies, but perspectives on different aspects, some of the social and ethical issues about machine learning applied to medicine. And then there's also a lot of work going on with data standards and interoperability, because another challenge that now that everyone has electronic health records is how to get the data talking to each other, the systems talking to each other, so we can test the data. And you can be part of it. There's a lot of career opportunities. I think I'm meeting with a bunch of students later. I actually, another one of my research interests is the health IT workforce, and have looked at various data sources, and the field just continues to grow. And if electronic health records continue to get taken up and expanded at the way that they are, there could be as many as 20,000 jobs around the country just in clinical informatics, not to say anything about bioinformatics or public health informatics, et cetera. I'd be happy, I'm not going to talk about it here, but be happy to tell anyone about our graduate program in informatics at OHSU. And actually, I realized that in seeing Melissa sitting in front of me that I should have put another bullet under, you can be part of it, the Clinical Data to Health Center, CD2H, that Melissa's the national PI of, and we're one of the participants at OHSU. So that's another way that you can be part of this. But anyways, I will stop at this point, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So let me start.
Yeah.
I know, first, thank you. I think this really kind of gets at a lot of the issues we sometimes take for granted when we're looking at using an electronic health record in research. I know a lot of talk has been around, standardization. Do you think the kind of work that you're doing will help vendors think of ways to either create tools to do queries or to standardize documents in electronic health records?
Hopefully. I think probably what's going to drive the vendors are the customers, and that's us, the medical centers, the clinicians, and so forth. And, because, I was actually talking a little bit over lunch about this. Because of the way that medical records were just mushroomed with all the government funding that went into it through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the HITECH Act. Before 2009, most organizations that were using electronic health records were academic medical centers. And then $30 billion out of the stimulus package from 2009, when Barack Obama first became president, went to providing incentives, because there was a lot of research that showed that there could be value to adopting electronic health records. The challenge is that it happened so fast that really the medical records, the healthcare institutions were not fully ready for it. So there's a lot of widespread implementation of electronic health records has been somewhat of a mixed blessing. It adds to the burden of physicians and other clinicians. And so, you know, it enabled the systems that were in place at that time to really just capture the market, you know, particularly Epic. And so now we're kind of going back and saying, okay, we want to be able to do things like this. So hopefully it will be really the healthcare industry that, and in fact it's happening already. There's a lot of emphasis now. The Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which kind of oversees certification and standards for electronic health records, are trying to put in place standards like, for example, this one called FHIR, which is kind of a data standard, to enable these sorts of things. So hopefully the things people want to do with research, with public health, healthcare quality will impact how medical records will be used, although again, their primary use still, of course, is, you know, documenting the care that people get.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
It's very informative. I am doing research in environmental and occupational health. So I picked up on when you said that there are the personal identifiable information that is scrubbed from the data, and I thought, well, that seems like a loss of an opportunity to understand the effect of place on health or occupation. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, it's a challenge because, you know, I think those of us who think about various kinds of health-related research see all this data and like, wow, you know, think of all the things we can do. And yet there are companies, Facebook, you know, that also see all this data and say, wow, think of all the products we can sell these people if we can link up their data. So, you know, I think it's a challenge. You know, and so, you know, part of it is going to involve laws and regulations. You know, I always get the acronym wrong. In Europe, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation or something, that starts to kind of spell out some of the things you can and can't do with data. And you know, what do you do for people who don't want their data to be part of this? So, you know, how do we achieve some kind of balance? Maybe part of it will be kind of locking up part of the data behind a firewall that, you know, you can only enter with very specific reasons to do so. You know, who's going to control that? There's a whole bunch of unanswered questions, but certainly being able to link other sources of data, because, you know, some people complain about the focus on medical records, ignoring you know, the rest of our lives. I mean, most of us only spend a small part of our lives in the healthcare system. And, you know, what about in our communities and things like that? So I don't know that really answers your question, but it's just some of the issues that come up when you talk about it.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I was intrigued by your description towards the end of being able to basically send search engines to the data instead of the data to search engines. Are there issues around sending executable code to secure databases?
Yes, absolutely. You know, although there are, you know, and actually I'm not a computer scientist, but as I am told, I mean, there are ways to secure. In fact, I know that the colleagues of mine who did the stuff with email, their systems were so-called air-gapped. The machines were actually not connected to a network. They were, you know, they literally brought the system on a probably, you know, external hard drive and plugged it into the system. The system itself was not on anyone's network. So that's certainly one way. That's a little challenging in this day and age to have a system that's not on the network. But there are technologies. In fact, you know, I mean, it's a big issue for, well, I'm sure it's not just medical centers, probably almost every industry, but we have a big challenge at OHSU, you know, when we can't just willingly, hey, I got this new program, I'm going to install it on a server inside the network. There has to be a you know, a review, you know, security review and things like that. So yeah, there are ways to protect from, you know, kind of executable code doing what it's not supposed to be doing, but it's always probably a challenge. Yeah.
Working in nutrition, we're looking at some things I'm sure that are transferable to any other disciplines in the hospital, literally looking to validate screening tools to catch people at risk, and then what happens with intervention differently from those that were not intervened upon, those kinds of things. If I walk into the community hospital in a town this size or in Portland, how equipped are they to ask those questions? You're kind of talking about a research application.
Yeah.
Do you have a feel for where we are industry-wise?
Yeah, actually, I mean, you know, most of the, you know, the kind of leading electronic health record systems have ways that you can configure screens. There's actually a sub-area of informatics called nutrition informatics, and I've actually done some work with some folks in the field. It's, you know, with the, you know, it takes someone to design the screens, to capture the information, and then if you want to start comparing people, you know, it takes someone with that clinical expertise to make those kinds of comparisons. But those sorts of things are doable. Certainly the top electronic health record systems, you know, that I'm aware of, you know, Epic, Cerner, have those sort of ability to generate screens. There's also another application, I know that it's starting to be used here, called REDCap, that it's not, well, it's not inside the electronic health record, although it has, you know, the ability to transfer information. But there are definitely ways to capture information. One of the big challenges at medical centers, big and small, is there's so much demand for these sorts of things that the IT departments have to kind of prioritize things, and you know, sometimes factors other than the most important clinical thing, you know, kind of carries the day. But it should be doable to do those kinds of things. Yes.
So, you know, I'm going to ask this question. So why does the synonym expansion not help? And well, do you think that you're just bumping up against the content that's actually there? That's first part one. Second question is, how do you deal with the fact that the UMLS has cycles in it, so that in terms of the information retrieval in that context?
So, well, actually, at least with this kind of data, the medical synonyms actually seem to help. It's the sort of general synonyms. You know, the problem with any kind of synonym, you know, synonym expansion is that you then run into polysems, you know, where you expand it into something that really doesn't mean that. Well, it may mean that, but it also means other things, and then it pulls in other things. So synonym expansion is always a kind of double-edged sword. But it seems that expanding along the lines of like the UMLS meta thesaurus achieved some benefit. You know, of course, you know, language is a challenge because it's used in different ways by different groups and so forth. As for the site, I don't think for this kind of task the cycle. I know the UMLS meta thesaurus has its imperfections, but I think most people are using it just in kind of first order synonym expansion, like. They might see an acronym like COPD, and then that gets expanded into chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, chronic obstructive lung disease, and so forth. And I don't think they really go much farther than that, so I don't know that the flaws in the meta thesaurus necessarily hurt this.
Well, join me in thanking Dr. Hersh.